Welcome you, I think, as people still drift in and find their seats. Thanks for being here this afternoon. I'm very pleased to see so many faces in the room at this time of day. Back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I was at college here with someone in the back of the room, Tom. And Tom and I were having a conversation one day about life at Gustavus in those times. And he said, you know, when I was a student here, I didn't know that I knew anything. Well, Tom and his brother Tim are farmers just outside of Le Sueur, north of here, on a century farm that's been in their family for 4 generations, thereabouts, 5 generations. And Tom knew a whole lot, but it was completely invisible here. There was sort of no place to talk about farming or to think about whether the dirt under our feet had any consequence or any meaning or any significance whatsoever. Obviously, times have changed significantly, dramatically, and I hope in a deep-rooted way, such that the future will look a lot different from what it was like back when mastodons were king. And one of the people who has been tremendously influential and involved in making those changes start to happen is our guest today, Fred Kirschenmann. Fred was recently awarded the National Resource Defense Council's one of their Green Thought Leader Awards for 2010, right? And I think that description of that title says it all, thought leader. He has been an incredibly important leader in thinking about rethinking and rethinking what sustainability means. He is presently a fellow at the Leopold Center. Is that the correct word, fellow? A guy? He's a fellow at the Leopold Center at Iowa State University, and in addition to that, he's the president of Kirschenmann Family Farms in North Dakota, which is a very large operation that is entirely organic, mixed livestock and small grains, he told me this afternoon, including the livestock includes some donkeys. And he also is the president of the board at the Stone Barn Center, which is a very different kind of agricultural enterprise out in New York State. And to give you a sense of how different it is, it has a restaurant involved, and that restaurant is chefed by Dan Barber, the guy about whom TED Talks are given. Fred is going to talk to us today about sustainability and the 21st century, and I am embarrassed that I have not written down the exact title, but you'll be happy to give it to us, I bet. Sustainable Farming into the 21st Century, the next chapter. And is brought to us today by the good graces of the Philosophy Department, the Johnson Center for Environmental Innovation, and the Sponberg Chair in Ethics.
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. My various involvements in life today take me around. I try not to travel outside the country, although a friend of mine wants me to go to Moldova in November, so I'll probably do that. But I travel a lot within the United States and to some extent to Canada and Mexico. And I have to tell you that it is such an inspiration to meet with the next generation, people who are in their late teens to early 30s. And even in the short time that I've been here, the few of you that I've met, I've sensed some of the same kind of energy and passion that I think we're going to need as we move into the future. First of all, can you all hear me okay? Okay. If I have hearing aids, so sometimes I don't know how loud I project, so if I'm not getting through, just raise your hand. I want to say, first of all, that I much prefer dialogue to monologue, but of course I came here to, present some ideas, which I'm going to do. But we'll have, I understand we can go till 5:30 if we want to, and I'm more than happy to do that. So I hope we can carry on some conversations around some of these issues. And the other thing I want to let you know is that I grew up in a Russian-German family, and us Russian Germans don't believe we've had a good day unless we've had at least one argument. So if you disagree with something that I say, I would hope that you would especially bring that into our conversation so that we can have some exchange around that. So let me start first of all. I've been involved in sustainable agriculture issues for the last 40 years or more. And it's been an interesting trip for me and some of the changes which have taken place. But one of the things that has been pretty consistent throughout this time, and I still run into some of it, is that some people will say, well, how can you be serious about this? You can't even define it. And for a long time, I thought, that was a legitimate question. But I'm at a point now where I'm coming to the conclusion it's not a legitimate question, because defining sustainability is actually pretty easy. You can go to any standard dictionary and it will tell you exactly what it is. Sustainability is about maintaining something, about keeping something going. So that's pretty simple, right? Where the debate comes in is how you keep something going, particularly with regard to agriculture. How do you maintain it? What's the way to do that? And that's where the current debate is. And to some extent, we even have a kind of food fight that's going on around that now. And so part of what I want to share with you this afternoon is what some of that debate is about now. And I think that in order to come to a meaningful conclusion around that question, how do we maintain, how do we keep going with our food and agriculture system, it's useful to look at that from the long trajectory of history. And I've put this timeline up on the board. This is one place where a PowerPoint would actually be useful, because I do have a slide for it, but it should work on a blackboard as well. And so I think in other words, the question is, how have we, as a human species, in our long time on the planet, fed ourselves? How have we maintained it? How have we kept it going up to now? And if you look at it from that perspective, and there's actually an anthropologist who's written about this quite eloquently in a book called Culture and Agriculture. And then there's a subtitle to it. And his name is Ernest Shusky. And it was published in 1989. It's out of print now, unfortunately. I'm trying to get the publisher to republish it, but I'm sure it's probably in your library here. And if not, you can get it from some library out there if you're interested in reading it. But anyway, Ernest Shusky, as you would expect as an anthropologist, looks at this question from the long sweep of history. So he argues that back from the time that our species, out of all of the hominoids, evolved about 25,000 years ago, 35,000 years ago, for that first 25,000 years, we fed ourselves as hunter-gatherers. We mostly lived in small tribal societies back then, and so we would hunt out a place, and then we'd move on to another place, and that's how we fed it. That's how we kept it going. That's how we maintained it. And he argues, interestingly enough, that from an energy input point of view, that was the most efficient food system we've ever had. That we probably got about 20 kilocalories of food for every single kilocalorie of energy that we invested in making that food available. And if you think about that, it simply makes sense, right? Because, we didn't domesticate plants and animals. We didn't do any seed breeding and animal breeding. We didn't do any cultivating, etc. We just went out, hunted, gathered, prepared it, and ate it. So it didn't take a lot of energy to make that available. And then along about 8,000 BC, we began to shift to a different kind of agriculture, and this is called the Neolithic era. And that's where we started to domesticate plants and animals. We started to cultivate. We started to select for the kinds of breeds of plants that would produce the best seeds, etc. So we went through this long bit. And it was primarily an agrarian kind of agriculture. That is, we used primarily human energy and animal energy as the means for producing this food. And then, and of course you can, and as he says, you can ask the question, why would we do that when we had to, say, use so little energy back here? Because this now took a lot more energy. And we, in fact, cut the energy efficiency about in half. So in this era now, we only got about 10 kilocalories of food for every kilocalorie of energy that we invested. But still pretty efficient. And there are, of course, some debates going on within the field of anthropology as to why we would have done that. But I think it's, to me at least, it's pretty obvious that the human species had expanded to a point where we started to live in settled societies. And so it became more difficult to hunt a place out and then move on to another place. So we had to start figuring out how to maintain, how to keep going, produce enough food as we lived in these settled communities. And at least to me, that makes sense why we would have done that and moved into this era. Now, Shusky argues that this era then was maintained for about 10,000 years, up until around 1930, in the 1930s roughly. And then we entered into a new era, which I love this term he calls the neo-caloric era. Because as he argues, it's almost entirely based on old calories. And I want to talk about these old calories a bit, because that's important for us to deal with as we talk about how to maintain, how to keep going with our future food and agriculture system. So and the point that he makes then is that the reason that this timeline is short, because he argues this will of necessity be a very short period of time in this long trajectory of how we fed ourselves, because these are old calories and we're using them up. And so once they're gone, then we can't do it this way anymore. And then the question, he says, is what's the next era of agriculture? How are we going to maintain and keep going the food system once we move beyond the neo-caloric era? And that's the key question that I'd like to have us think about. And I think it's the basis for this debate that we have in our culture now about what our future food system should be like and what we need to invest in as we move into the future. So what are some of these old calories? Well, there's a lot of conversation now in the media, et cetera, about peak, right? Peak oil, peak this, peak that. In fact, Richard Heinberg, in one of his most recent books now, he's been writing about energy for quite a bit, and he's now written a book which he calls Peak Everything. And I think that's exactly appropriate, because he is picking up on what Ernest Shusky says about this era. These are old calories and we're using them up, and so we're going to reach peak in a lot of things. So here are some of the peaks. Now, obviously, one of the peaks is energy. It's not just peak oil, it's peak natural gas, it's peak uranium, all of these other old calories that we're using as our energy source. And personally, I think that one of the difficulties that we have in our current dialogue is we're talking about our energy as a kind of simple transition, right? In Iowa, we like to talk about, what we got to do is wean ourselves from Mideast oil, and you name your favorite one. For some it's wind, for some it's solar, for some it's corn ethanol, etc. And the kind of assumption behind that is that once we do that, we make that transition, then everything can kind of continue as it always has. And of course, that is absolutely not true. And the reason is because the energy resources that we have in this neo-caloric era is stored concentrated energy. Oil, natural gas, coal, uranium, all of these things are stored concentrated energy that has developed, in the body of this planet over millions of years. It's like the first law of thermodynamics. You can neither destroy nor create energy. It's always been constant. It's that energy changes from one form to another. So over a long period of time, of millions of years, we had this oil and coal and natural gas, etc., stored in the body of the planet, and the only way I had to do was tap in and extract it and process it and make it available. Enormously energy efficient from an energy in for energy out perspective. Energy profit ratio is energy people like to talk about. In fact, in the other thing to keep in mind here is that this is a relatively short period of time. The first producing oil well in this country was in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania. It's a little over 150 years ago. That's not that long ago, And today we kind of live like it's forever. And so this has been a relatively short period of time, and especially in that early era of this of oil, the energy efficiency was enormous. In crude oil, we were getting about 100 calories of energy for every single calorie of energy invested in making that energy available. That was the energy profit ratio that we got used to. And when I was a college student, as you are, I can still remember buying gas for 20 cents a gallon. And it's because it was so energy efficient. Well, now we're at about 20 kilocalories of energy for each calorie invested, because now we're having to drill 2 miles down in the Gulf of Mexico. We're having to use fracturing to break through the shale, et cetera, et cetera. It's taking a lot more energy now to get that remaining energy. So at some point we're going to reach peak. Peak being the point at which demand starts to exceed supply. And it's probably not going to be this nice curve like we often see. It's going to be more like this because, you get to a certain point where your demand starts to exceed supply, and then the price goes up, and then you can spend more money to get some of the remaining, so then you start to have some come up. But the long term is, we're going to go at a time when we no longer have the stored, concentrated energy available. And at that point, the energy that we get for the energy that we invest in making it available is going to be much, much lower. And all of the data on this is clear now. Wind and hydroelectric dams are two of the more efficient alternative energy. Wind, depending on where it is and all of that, probably somewhere between 14 and 16 kilocalories out for each calorie in. Hydroelectric dams, somewhere about the same. When you look at things like corn ethanol, depending on how you do the data, it could be 1.2 to 1.6 kilocalories out for each kilocalorie in. So, so the point is that the era of cheap energy is going to be over. And then we have to ask ourselves, how is that going to affect the way in which we have maintained and kept going our food system in this brief period of time? Okay. So energy is one of the peak things. Another peak thing is water. We're using up our fresh water resources all across the planet, also which has been stored up since the Ice Age. The Ogallala Aquifer, which is the source of irrigation water for most of agriculture in the heartland, we've drawn down by half since 1960. And this is fossil water. This cannot be recharged very rapidly. And this is true all across the planet, especially places like China and India, where they're drawing down their groundwater. And in China, according to Lester Brown, something like 10 feet a year. India, something like 20 feet a year. And so again, this is not something you can keep going. So the question then becomes, how are we going to keep going? How are we going to maintain our food system when we only have like half the amount of water available that we're currently using? Right now, 70% of our fresh water resources on the planet are being used just for agricultural irrigation. And one of the reasons, and here's where we're going to start looking at some of the interconnections here, one of the reasons we're using so much irrigation water is because with all of this cheap energy that we've had, where we could simply, insert synthetic nutrients to produce our yields that we wanted without paying attention to the biological health of the soil doesn't absorb and retain as much water anymore, so we have to use more irrigation water. So these things begin to, interplay with each other. Okay, so we got energy, we got water, peak fertilizer. One of the other resources that we've been using, of course, are rock phosphate and potassium, which provides our phosphorus and potash, critical fertilizers in maintaining our current food production system. We now only have 4 countries that still have reserves of potash. China having the largest reserve, about 30% of the world's supply. It's not the greatest quality of potash or rock phosphate. The United States only has about 7%. And we only have 4 countries that still have reserves of potassium. Canada having the largest reserves, of a little over 50%. And we're using more because one of the other things that's happening at this same period of time, quite understandably, we have populations in the developing world who are looking at us in the developed world and this lifestyle that we say is the way that everybody ought to live, and they're obviously wanting to emulate that. And so they're starting to use more fertilizers, et cetera, to increase their productivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, this is at some point, these reserves are no longer going to be there. So again, the question becomes, how are we going to keep maintaining it in that future? And then, of course, there's what some people like to call peak land. We have also, through much of this period of time, there was usually more land available somewhere, and especially in this country, the frontier. And when our ancestors first settled on the East Coast and did some farming practices that weren't, self-renewing, and so, we can go to Iowa, or we can, there was always another place to go. But that's over now. land is basically now occupied. The only other land that we would have available are land which everybody agrees we need to keep in, like, both forests, and most of those are gone already anyway, but, the wildlands, et cetera. And, that, if we were to turn that land into agricultural food production land, it would be disastrous in terms of a number of things, which I'm sure you all know about, but we can talk about in the question and answer period if you want. And then there's also peak seafood, because we have also been over-exploiting our seafood resources to a point now where there's a question about whether or not, in some places, if you destroy it to a certain level, then it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to regenerate it and produce it. And the seafood isn't only because we're harvesting so much of it for ourselves as humans, but also for part of the rest of our agricultural system. We're currently using about 6 times more seafood to feed hogs and chickens than we do humans. And so, we have to, again, look at this, because at some point, that resource, is not going to be there anymore. Okay, so this is part of this picture, and I'm going to get to some good news, so don't, don't say, oh my God, I'm going to have to go before I go crazy here. But there are a few other things. One of the important things, if we're going to really be serious about imagining this new system, we have to be serious about what the problems are here and why this cannot continue. So that's what we're doing right now. So there's some concurrent things that we have to look at in addition to these peak resources that we've been looking at. One of those, of course, is what's happening to climate. And here again is where you've got this intersection. Part of the reason that we are going to have this dramatic change in our climate is because of the amount of energy that we have used, which of course has now, again, you can neither create nor destroy energy, but you transform it. So in the process of using so much energy here, one of the things we've done is begun to destabilize that dynamic equilibrium in the atmosphere, which has maintained the stable climates that we've had going all the way back to about 11,000 years, this period of time that Diane Domination refers to as the long summer in her new book, The End of the Long Summer. So one of the reasons that we've been so successful with maintaining our productivity during this period of time is because we've had these unusually, or as the National Academy of Science referred to it, abnormal stable climates. And if you're going to have the kind of monocultures which have been part of the success of the way we've produced food during this period of time, then you have to have these stable climates. 92% of our cultivated land in Iowa now is in just 2 crops, corn and soybeans. So you need to have consistently have climates that are favorable to those 2 crops to maintain productivity. And from everything that we know now from our climatologists, given this destabilization that we've created, that's probably not going to be the case. We're going to see what we're going to see as a more unpredictable, unstable kinds of climate. So again, we have to ask the question, how do we maintain productivity as we move out of this period with those new circumstances? And then we've got part of the other issue with our food system is the amount of food that gets wasted in our current system. And there was a report put out by the Stockholm International Water Institute, which claims that we are currently producing 4,600 calories of food from crop-related production system. 4,600 calories for every man, woman, and child on the planet every day. And what we're only consuming 2,000 of those calories. The rest of it gets, quote, wasted. So if you think about it in those terms, we're already producing more than enough food to feed those 9 billion people that everybody's concerned about. But we're wasting so much of it. So part of the question that we need to address as we look at this future is how do we create a food system where we aren't wasting so much of it? Now, to be fair, part of their definition of waste is when you're feeding these plant food calories that could be fed to humans and feed them to animals. And they see that as waste. I happen to disagree with that because I think the animals are a critical part of maintaining a healthy system. So, but we don't have, one of the things they're right about is we don't have to feed certainly not as much grain as we're currently feeding to animals. So if we start to think about a food system where animals consume something that they naturally, in their environmental history or their evolutionary history, evolved eating, and ruminants at least evolved eating grass, eating plants, not grain. So we need to begin to think, as we think about the future of our food system, what's an appropriate ratio of plants to animals in terms of our food system to have the maximum amount of calories available for humans, rather than asking, how do we force nature to produce more? So some of that involves this kind of rethinking, and then also thinking about it in terms of how are we going to maintain healthy ecosystems which are going to continue to be productive, which are essentially self-renewing. That's part of the future that we have to think about. And here again, is the way in which we manage our crop livestock systems becomes an important part of that. And we can, again, get into that more when we go into our question. And then there's a lot of food that gets wasted. And incidentally, as I mentioned in the class a bit ago, one of the things which I understand that you've accomplished here is dramatically reduce the amount of food waste in your cafeteria. And we should celebrate that, and we should really see what from that is replicable and made available, to other colleges and universities, and then sort of become a model. So we start to develop a consciousness about the importance of reducing the amount of food waste that's currently part of our food system. And then another really key issue in all of this is the loss of biodiversity and genetic diversity. Because as we think about this, how we're going to design this future system, the diversity of our biological diversity and our genetic diversity is going to be a critical resource that we're going to need in redesigning the food system. Because one of the things we have to think about now is that you can't have this kind of monoculture, globalized sort of approach to these problems, because particularly with climate change, which is going to have different effects in different parts of the planet, so we're going to have to figure out how to design food systems that are productive and appropriate to each thermal climate on the planet. And so we're going to need all of the biodiversity and genetic diversity we can lay our hands on. And we've been going exactly the wrong direction. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has reported that in the last 100 years we've lost about 3/4 of our crop varieties because we've only bred for special effects, right? And so we've basically lost a lot of that diversity. And we've lost about 1,300 out of the 6,300 species of animal breeds during that same period of time. So one of the main things that we need to address now as a global agriculture is how do we, first of all, retain the diversity we have left, and then restore some of that biodiversity so that we have that resource available as we redesign the future. And then another resource that we've lost, which I think is critical, is our human capital, our farmers. When the 2007 census data came out, there was all this euphoria because we went from 2.1 million farmers to 2.2 million, an increase in the first time. And there was only one journalist that I know of that picked up on the issue, and that was Lisa Hamilton, who wrote an op-ed in the Prairie Writers Circle. And she said, so we went from 2.1 million to 2.2 million farmers, and that sounds like a really good deal, but nobody's asking what a farm is. And then she stated the definition that we're currently using for a farm, that USDA currently using. It's a definition which was adopted in 1974. And that is any place which produces $1,000 in gross sales, or would have produced $1,000 in gross sale, had that place exercised the full potential of its productive capacity. And so she says, I live in a suburban home and I have 4 chickens in my backyard, and if I really maximize the full potential of 4 chickens, I can sell $500 worth of eggs. So all I need is 4 more chickens and I'm a farmer. And of course she's right. Now, this is not to demonize the small farmers. As far as I'm concerned, anybody that produces $500 worth of good food and brings it to a farmer's market, I want to honor them as a farmer. But in terms of our social understanding of what's happening to our human capital, our population of farmers, we have to come to terms with what's actually happening. And if you start to break that data down from 2007 and pull it apart, 75% of our current total food and agriculture production is now produced by just 192,442 farms in this country. Think about that for a minute. 75% of our total production from 192,442 farms. And 30% of our farmers are now over age 65 and only 5% are under age 35. Now, I don't know how you feel about that, but as I look at this, as I start to look at the challenges that we're going to be facing in creating this new future for our food, we're going to need some of the most creative, intelligent, passionate farmers that we've ever had in the history of agriculture in this country. And we're doing very little to encourage that. We're doing very little to develop that population of farmers to address these issues with us. It's something that we have to look at. Okay, so one other thing that we should get straight is that we always talk about the importance of cheap food in all of this, and then we have the cheapest food in the world, right? But again, if you look at how we arrived at that statistic, it's that we spend less of our average disposable income than anybody else on the planet. Canada and Australia are pretty close to us, but it's now a little less than 10%, which sounds like really great. The problem is that our average disposable income is also so much higher than the rest of the world that it doesn't really tell you anything about the actual cost of food. And I had a conversation with Chuck Benbrook, who used to be the head of agriculture for the National Academy of Sciences. And I told him, I said, this is the wrong metric because it doesn't really tell us what food actually costs. And he said, that's right. So he went to work and did a new calculation looking at the cost of food per calorie. And when you look at it that way, we're actually 23rd on the list. There are 22 countries today that have cheaper food than we do on a cost per calorie basis. And I said to Chuck, that's still the wrong metric because you can have food that's very high in calories but has no nutrient value, so that's still not giving you, cheap food. And he said, that's right, but that's a lot more complicated, he said. but that's, so we have to begin to, and we really don't have a cheap food policy. What we have is a cheap labor and cheap raw materials policy. And that's what drives our current food system. And it's part of what's driving us currently in the wrong direction in terms of the kind of innovation that we're stimulating in terms of addressing these issues, for our future food system. So let's move on to then what are some of the things that we need to think about, that we need to address now as we move into this new era and the kind of food system that we want to design and create that can keep going, can maintain, that can be sustainable. Well, I think one of the first things that we need to attend to in all of our communities throughout the planet, and again, part of the good news coming out of the new UN report that just came out this past week begins to address this, and that is to restore the biological health of our soil. Because that's ultimately the foundation of everything. It all starts with the soil. And we have not paid attention to the biological health of our soil for at least 60 years now in industrial agriculture. Because we didn't have to. You always had that cheap energy to come in with the synthetic fertilizers, the pesticides, whatever you needed, so we didn't have to pay attention. In fact, even soil scientists, when I started my career in higher education back in the 1960s, soil scientists were talking about soil as a material to hold a plant in place. That was its only function. And then you did everything you needed to do to support the plant. The soil simply held the plant in place. Well, fortunately, we've moved beyond that, but we have not yet come to recognize the importance of restoring the biological health of soil. And here's where we need to come to terms with what soil actually is. Generally in our culture, we still sort of think of soil as dirt. Soil is actually a living community. There are more living organisms beneath the surface of the soil than there are above the surface of the soil. And that living community has to be nourished. And the best way to nourish it is to provide it with humus. That's the food of the organisms in the soil. And humus comes from returning all of the so-called wastes back to the soil for its food source. And today, all of our waste gets put into landfills, etc. I mean, this is something we've got to change in our whole way in which we conduct ourselves. And we should never now waste any kind of biodegradable material that could be composted and returned to soil. And here again, fortunately, there's some good news. The City of New York has now come up with a new food charter, which the City Council has put out for public comment. And one of the components of this new food charter is a citywide composting program. Imagine that for the City of New York. And one of the reasons they're planning on doing that is not only because they are now beginning to realize the importance of that for the future food system for New York, but also because the cost of continuing to put their waste into landfills is simply becoming, unsustainable. So here are some things, that we should start to pay attention to in terms of those stimulations for change that we can push and move in the right direction to solve some of these problems. But in any case, however we do it, because if we restore the biological health of our soil, we reduce the amount of irrigation water required, so it starts to solve that problem. The Rodale Institute did some research recently in which they pointed out that if you have 1% organic matter in your soil, and that's only one indicator of a healthy soil, if you have 1% organic matter, the soil has the capacity to absorb and retain about 33 pounds of water per cubic yard. If you have 5% organic matter, it's 195 pounds. So we could reduce our irrigation requirement by a factor of 6 simply by restoring the biological health of soil from 1% organic matter to 5% organic matter. Now, I'm not saying that's easy everywhere. Places like Iowa and parts of Minnesota where we have very rich soil, you could get to that relatively easily. In places like Africa, it's going to be more difficult. But the more we can move in that direction to create that biological health of the soil, we begin to solve that problem. And, of course, the other thing that you do, biologically healthy soil, stores fertility in the soil, so you begin to need far less fertilizers to maintain the productivity in order to keep going in this new area that we need to go. Now, that's number one. Secondly, we need to restore the biological diversity and genetic diversity, and I already touched on that, so I'm not going to go into more detail on that. If we want to in the question period. Thirdly, I think one of the things we need to do, this is a social equation of this, is to rethink how we all become engaged around food. For much of this period of time here in the neocaloric era, we all just became passive consumers. We went to the supermarket or the fast food restaurant or wherever, and we got the food that we wanted. We didn't think about where it came from or who was doing it. It was not our concern. It wasn't anything that interested us. That's starting to change. And there was in fact a culture that we developed in our industrial food system where we didn't want people to do that. We didn't want people to become engaged. In fact, Bill Heffernan, a good friend of mine, taught for a number of years at the University of Missouri. He said that if the industrial food system were to choose an appropriate logo for itself, it would be "Just Eat It." Don't ask any questions about it. Don't ask where it came from. Just eat it, and we'll take care of everything else. Well, that, again, in our new food culture is starting to change. And people are now wanting to become engaged. They want to, not everybody, but there's a growing number that do. And I think we should encourage that. And I think as we think about this new future, instead of having this sort of nameless global food system, what we're going to have is a series of networks of local food. And by local, I don't mean just a geographic distance, but I mean communities of people. I, in fact, prefer the word food shed, which is becoming common parlance in our literature now. A food shed is a metaphor borrowed from a watershed. And watersheds are not all the same size, but they're appropriate to their place. So food sheds would be communities of people who produce as much of the food as possible by people in the food shed, for people in the food shed, and do so in terms of what the community determines is important to the sustainability of food in their community, so that people in effect become food citizens. And I think this is a very important part of this dynamic. And again, we're starting to see this happen, around the country, and that's part of the good news. Okay. And part of this food shed concept is is another factor here, which is now being referred to as food sovereignty. It's a concept that was developed in the Global South, actually, by the Via Campesina group, in which they felt it was important for their own future, as they think about the future food system, for them to be actively engaged, actually have some say over the food within their own communities. So these food shed concepts would develop this notion of food sovereignty within their own communities. So let's talk a little bit about, and I've sort of touched on this a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit about, because you could probably look at this, and see where we are now and all of these challenges we're seeing in the future and say, oh, no, we're in deep trouble. It's not going to happen. But let's look at some of the things that are already happening. And there are a number of things I think that are worth mentioning here. The kind of citizen engagement that we're seeing all across the planet now. And again, I don't want to romanticize it like saying all of this is terrific and it's all going to turn out great. But this unrest which we're seeing, which is taking place in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Wisconsin, these are all part of a new engagement on the part of citizens. And Paul Hawken wrote about this a number of years ago in his book, The Blessed Unrest. Remember that? And after 4 years of research, he said that there is this unrest all across the planet where there are hordes of people, in their ordinary communities who are not, they're not happy with what's going on. There's this sense of unrest about them. And he argued already when he wrote, I think he published a book like 4 years ago, he said that all it takes is some kind of trigger event, to energize this blessed unrest, to bring about significant changes on our planet. And I think that we're starting to see that, and that blessed unrest, in fact, already, food is one of the triggers in this. The revolt in Tunisia started because a vegetable vendor was not allowed to sell his vegetables, and so he decided to set himself on fire as a revolt, as a reaction to that, and that's what triggered, the revolution that took place there. So food is already engaged, involved in that. So we should, and if you think about this, we've got this transition which is starting to take place. And this is what I want to come down to the second thing. So you've got this unrest and this citizen engagement taking place. And at the same time, that's happening to some extent because there is something that Richard Ugo, who published a book in the Harvard Press Business School in, I think, 1997, called Smart World. And he wrote the book primarily to the business community, primarily to alert the business community how they can prepare for the kinds of changes that take place in terms of their effectiveness in business. But what he wrote about also applies to not only to business, but to all of the rest of our lives. And he pointed out that we often think that change happens through this kind of linear cause-effect relationship. So you have some kind of Lone Ranger that comes in and comes in with a new idea or a new initiative, and then there's this cause-effect relation that brings about the change. But he says if you look at it historically, that's not the way change happens at all. He says what happens is that you have this new, what he calls idea space, a new idea space. That's why he calls it smart world. It's not the genius of an individual brain, it's the smart world that creates the opportunity for change. And he uses some examples that I don't particularly like how Barbie dolls became popular. But one example that he uses is Cubism in art and how that revolution took place. And he said, we always attribute that to Picasso, like he was the Lone Ranger that made that happen. But he said, if you look at how that happened, that's not the way it happened. What happened was there were a lot of people in the world of art which were already dissatisfied with some of the traditional forms and were critical about that. Some were already experimenting with some alternative approaches, etc. So it created this idea space. And then Picasso came into that idea space and put it on canvas, and it changed the world of art forever. And when I read that, I thought, this is exactly what's happening in the food system today. You could not have imagined 10 years ago a Michael Pollan writing a book about food and have it be on the New York Times bestseller list for years. It would not have happened. And now, today, it's happening all the time. You could not have imagined the college here having a program around food as part of the focus of your educational program here 10 years ago, right? It would not have happened. So we have this new idea space now, so it creates the opportunity for significant changes to take place, to prepare us for fashioning and shaping this next food system in order to maintain it and keep it going. And then we have, and I already alluded to this a little bit, one of the other really exciting things that's happening right now is we got this new generation of young people all across the industrial world who want to farm. You know, and in my involvement out of the Stone Barn Center just outside of New York, you know, I run into this all the time. We now run a annual beginning farmer conference, and we only have room for 220 young people. And every year that we run this conference, we have a list of about 80 people on the waiting list that we can't accommodate because we don't have room for them. We're now thinking about hiring a full-time person just to run these conferences and do maybe 2 or 3 a year so we can accommodate the interest and the concern around it. So we've got, you know, these young people, and they don't want to raise corn or soybeans. Not that that's bad. You know, they want to raise food for people. They want to have this relationship with the people that they provide the food for. It's a whole new vision of the food system. It's part of this new idea space, you know, that's happening. And you know what these young people need. And in the class that I attended earlier today, I asked, you know, out of the class, I asked how many grew up on a farm. 2 hands went up, and I asked how many of them are interested in raising food, and almost every hand in the classroom went up. So you know, we need to provide them with access to land, access to affordable capital, access to the kind of markets, so they can have a decent life. Those are the only 3 things we need. We can address those to a large extent in terms of our public policies. And again, part of what we need to do as we think about the future. So the other thing that I think is important here, and I also mentioned this in the class, is that we have to begin to address and involve the world of the arts and the humanities in this. Because, you know, if you and I can't imagine a better future than the one that we have right now, we're going to be resistant to become involved in any changes, right? So we have to begin to imagine a world that's in fact better than the one that we have now, particularly around food and agriculture. And I think we can do that. I think that there are some real possibilities. And part of the reason that some of our young generation want to farm is because they have a different vision of what it means to farm, with these kinds of relationships within communities, et cetera, which are an enriching experience for them. Not that there aren't still a lot of challenges and problems. We don't know there are, but there's some that we can address. So the arts can help us to imagine what this future food system can look like and how we can experience it. And we know that we can have much better tasting food than what we've had in the last 20 years. We know that it can be more supportive of communities and more engaging of communities, and people become involved in it more. We know that it can be environmentally more sound than what it's been. I mean, we have not paid attention to the unintended consequences of our current industrial food system, and we have to come to terms with that, and then imagine one in the future that is much more healing and fulfilling than what we've had. And the good news here again is that the world of art now can do this with us at far less expenditure than we would have been able to do 20 years ago. It doesn't take $1 million to do a movie now. You know, you can do a documentary for much less than that. You can do a YouTube for a few bucks. And these are very powerful kinds of images that we can and art that we are presenting now. And getting back to soil, let me just give you one example. Deborah Garcia, who's a filmmaker, she did The Future of Food, which some of you may have seen. She has now spent the last 4 years putting together a new documentary on soil. It's going to be a 2-hour-long documentary called The Symphony of Soil, and it's projected to come out sometime this summer. And I've seen some of the trailers of this, and I can tell you that anybody that sees that is no longer going to think about soil as dirt, because it provides this incredible experience around what soil is really like. And she visited farmers all across the planet who are managing their farms in terms of restoring the biological health of their soils and telling their story. And it's going to be a very powerful piece. So this is one of the, and hers is not going to be cheap, but she has the resources to do it. So that's what she decided to do. And she's a very good publicity person. So I think that we'll see that documentary throughout the country. But it's again one example of some of the kinds of things that we can do. So let me. I'm going to close now with a couple of big elephants in the room that we have to deal with. And I'm a theologian by training, and so in addition to my experience as a farmer, I'm also informed by what are the these fundamental principles and values that we hold that to a large extent lead us to how we behave and what we do. And one of the big problems, and there are a number of people that have written about this now, is that most of us still operate out of a theology which is dysfunctional, particularly now in terms of this new direction we need to move in. And that's a theology of domination. We see ourselves as separate from creation, as separate from nature, and that it's not only our ability, but our responsibility, to dominate nature, to force nature to do what we want. And if you think about this, even in terms of our biblical background, we were already warned way back then that this is not the direction to move in. And I realize there are some passages in Genesis about that we are given dominion. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but my colleagues who are tell me that did not mean, in the Hebrew, that does not mean that you are domination, that you are sort of the Lord over, but that you are in the place of the Lord. It's the dominus notion. So you should take care of creation as if you were the Lord taking care of it, not that you are supposed to be the lording over it kind of thing. But even apart from that, aside from that, if you look at the story of the Garden of Eden in Genesis, it makes it very clear. There are two trees, right? There's the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And which one are you supposed to eat from? The tree of life, right? The tree of life is what life is. That's your guide. Listen to nature. Listen to creation. Fit what you do into nature. If you start to eat off the tree of knowledge, if you know better than creation and start to dominate it, then you start to have a series of curses that come into your life. So all of that's very clear already back then. But through this period of time, going back to the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, we came to believe, as René Descartes put it, that we have to be the possessors and masters of nature, and we have to bend nature to our will, as Francis Bacon put it. And so this is our culture now. This is the big elephant in the room. We all operate still out of that mindset. And that's something that we all have to change. And here is where I would invite all of you who are particularly at a wonderful institution like this, because I think it's our liberal arts colleges that have the capacity to begin to help shape this kind of cultural notion much more than our more specialized institutions. And begin to think about how do we start to reshape that we are in fact partners, not dominators. We are partners with nature. And again, there are some excellent resources here that you can look at. Riane Eisler, who has written a couple of wonderful books. One is called The Chalice and the Blade, and the other is The Real Wealth of Nations. And Riane Eisler has looked again at this whole thing historically, and she argues that, we used to think, and archaeologists were big about this, that back here during the era of the hunter-gatherer, that we became a warrior society, and so the blade was the symbol, because we had to go out there and kill those animals, right, and harvest them and bring them in to eat them. But she's saying that the more recent archaeological findings now are proving exactly the opposite. That what we had to do back here in order to feed ourselves was to cooperate with each other, to function as partners in order to acquire the food together. So it wasn't the blade, it was the chalice, it was the glass of wine around which we congregate as a community that became the symbol. And that the dominator approach, this warrior approach, actually only happened goes back about 5,000 years ago, and that it's now, she says, increasingly becoming dysfunctional, and we have to recapture this notion of partnership, of community, that it's not the gospel of consumption which gives us the quality of life, it's the gospel of community. Again, certainly those of us in the Judeo-Christian faith, this is a part of our faith heritage as well. So that's that one big elephant. A second big elephant in the room is that we seem to be totally focused on the short-term effect and the short-term return. If you're in any kind of business or a farmer, it's specialization, simplification of management, economies of scale, and maximum production and short-term return, right? That's what you do. Well, my father, who had a 6th grade education, and he and my mother started farming in 1930 as beginning farmers, so it was during the era of the Dust Bowl. And he became very frugal as a result of that, and of course wanted to instill that frugality into his young son. And so he would literally, about once a month from the time I was probably 5 years old, he would grab me by the collar, pull me to the kitchen table, and he always had the receipts of everything that he sold in one shoebox and the invoices of everything that he bought in another, and he would show me how those needed to balance out. And after we went through this exercise for a couple of years, suddenly one day it occurred to me that we were making much more income off of our annual crops than we were off of our livestock. And it was a question to me, why were we doing this? At one point I just turned to him, I said, so Dad, I said, we're making much more money on our crops now, why do we still have cows? And he turned to me without missing a beat and he said, because they don't get hailed out. It's not just maximum production and short-term return, it's that ability, to be resilient and productive over a longer period of time. And so it's another one of those kinds of cultural shifts, I think, that we have to make in our thinking. So let me stop there, and hopefully this will stimulate some questions and discussion, and left this as long as I'd like to. Yes?
I've got a little bit of a technical question for you. When you talk about putting organic matter back into the soil, I've got about 6 acres on a farm, and I think that's doable for us. When you're looking at these large farms and thousands of acres, where do you see this organic matter coming from to get back into the soil, raise these humus level back in the soil?
Well, I think the short answer to your question is that as we move into this new future, we're not going to see 25,000 acre farms anymore.
Sure.
Richard Heinberg talks about the fact that by 2040, 2050, we're going to have 40 to 50 million people in this country engaged in producing food in one way or another. So a much larger population of people who actually engage in producing food. That's going to mean operations that are not going to be as large, not going to be as monoculture. They're going to be more diverse. When I say that, I'm very aware that I'm saying some things that, first of all, are going to add to this food fight. That a lot of people who are committed to simply intensifying the current system as the solution are going to say, I'm crazy, and this is not the way we can feed the world. But increasingly now, evidence is beginning to evolve, and this new UN report that just came out this last week is a perfect example of that. And with the future which they envision is, especially in the developing world, more people engaged in their own communities, out of their own culture, using their local resources, and restoring the biological health of their soil, et cetera, to increase their productivity. And they're arguing that there's enough evidence now that we could double the productivity of food in those countries using that approach. So I think that, the short answer to your question is, if restoring the biological health of our soil is a critical component of being able to sustain and maintain productivity in the future, then that's going to become a bigger priority than how many acres you can farm in a short period of time. And we're going to see, and it's going to be a transition. It's going to take over time. It's going to happen next week. But I think that we'll see that transition take place. And and then you're going to have more. And again, you know, part of the issue here is, you know, people say, well, you want to go back to, you know, and then take your pick, 1930, and say, I don't want to go back. You know, I was on a farm in the late 1930s and the 1940s. I don't want to go back to it. And even if I wanted to, that's not possible. We can never go back. But what we can do is take some of the wisdom from the past, the things we've learned from the past, and then marry that with the best science available today. To me, one of the great mistakes in our current educational system, and by that I don't mean just, you know, college and university, I mean our total educational system, is that we have not paid attention to what we have learned in the fields of ecology and evolutionary biology, you know, over the last 30 or 40 years that could be applied to agriculture. And there's a tremendous resource. I mean, some of the work that C.S. Hollings, et cetera, you know, has developed over the last 30 or 40 years it would be tremendously useful. It could help us revolutionize agriculture. And we basically, you know, we do have some people in ecology now that have taken an interest in agriculture, and they're doing some very interesting research. We have very few people in agriculture that are looking at the field of ecology, and that's one of the things we do. And you have, you know, people like Wes Jackson of the Land Institute. This is what has driven his vision, because that's exactly what he's done. And a little bit of good news again. Kathleen Merrigan here just 2 weeks ago hung the pictures of the root systems. Have you seen those?
No.
The Land Institute has now developed an actual photograph of a perennial wheat root system compared to an annual. The perennial is about 18 feet long, a very robust root system, about 15 inches in diameter. The annual root system is about 4 inches in diameter and about 10 inches long. And she's got those hanging now in the entrance to USDA, or did at least for a couple of weeks. And USDA has now responded to Wes's invitation to commit some scientists to work with the Land Institute to develop our perennial crops. So if we can, here's again, using the principles of ecology and evolutionary biology, with sufficient research, we could transform about 60% of our annual cropland into perennials over the next 50 years. That would not only help to restore the biological health of our soil, but it would reduce the need for water. It would, you know, address all of these other issues.
Build soil.
Yeah.
Are they having success with some of these I mean, they're trying. I don't think a lot of people know what they're doing there. They're trying to turn annual crops into perennial crops.
Yeah.
Are they having success with any of them?
Yeah. There's a variety called Carenza. It's not quite at the yield level yet of annual crops, but it's improving each year. And the Carenza wheat now, which they've developed into a flour, it actually has a much higher nutrient value than the annual crops that we currently have. And the bread from the flour tastes terrific. Again, we're not there yet.
Right.
You know, we're not ready to commercialize it, but you know, the right kind of research effort in another, you know, 10 to 12 years, we could have plenty of wheat out there in the landscape.
I see a question way over on the
Yeah, yeah.
As residents of the Liberal Art College, we like the love you showed us. by
Can you
saying-
speak up a little bit?
Oh, sorry, yeah. The love you showed us towards liberal arts feels nice, but as a child of farmers, who grew up on a farm, and in conversations with other people and my experience, liberal arts colleges in the past, I think that there may be some changing, have not always been affirming of agricultural backgrounds and of that kind of knowledge.
Yeah.
Can you articulate or describe how you'd imagine a transformation to liberal arts curriculum
Yeah.
that does that
Yeah.
without losing what
Yeah.
liberal arts
Yeah.
do well?
That's a great question, and there isn't any magic bullet solution to it. But here again is what's some of the things that are happening. All across this country now, students are putting pressure on their food service because they're not happy with the kind of food they're getting anymore. And so that's bringing pressure. So schools like Yale now has developed a garden. Harvard is in the process of developing a garden. So you're seeing this happen, you know, all across the country. How rapidly it will happen, I don't think it's something that's a fad that's going to go away. because, you know, this transition that we're talking about is not going to be a short-term thing. This is going to be long-term. So I think there's going to be an increasing awareness of the importance of doing this, not just for the food at the university, but that in turn is going to create a new kind of mindset around it. So that's one thing that's happening. Another thing that's happening, my good friend Dan Barber, who I have the honor and pleasure of working with at the Stone Barns, was invited to Dartmouth College 2 weeks ago because they had a big conference around food. And Dartmouth is a fairly conservative school. They don't even have a great environmental studies program. But they have an alumnus who has come to them and offered them $200 million as a gift if they would transform their curriculum to take the future of food and agriculture seriously. So, you know, again, it's part of this new idea space that's taking place, and we can't predict at this point all of those things that are likely to happen. I think, however, and this is my own prejudiced personal experience, that the possibility of this happening in our liberal arts college at this point is much greater than it is at our land-grant universities. Because our land-grant universities, unfortunately, have allowed themselves to get so locked into the neo-caloric era system that they're putting almost, and I'm not saying that everybody is there. We have some individual researchers and faculty that are clearly moving in the other direction, but the majority of the resources are devoted to intensifying and preserving the current system rather than exploring the new alternatives. And my experience is, like in Iowa, it's at Grinnell and Central College of Pella and those kinds of places, you know, where it's the biology departments and the environmental studies departments who are starting to explore the alternatives in food systems. So I'm actually hopeful about that. Yes?
You mentioned perennial crops. Now, one aspect of farming that I recall is that you rotate crops in order to deal with the soil properly, whereas if you had perennial crops, there would be no rotation.
Yeah, what the Lands Institute is proposing is polycultures. So you wouldn't just seed wheat, but you would seed wheat and maybe a legume in there with that, et cetera. So you would have a polyculture arrangement. And then you would probably kill that, you know, destroy that perennial polyculture every 5 or 6 years and plant it into something else. But the point that you're making is critical, because any time that you have a monoculture, you're going to invite, you know, pests and diseases that are adapted to that. So the theory, at least, is, and you know, nature doesn't have a monoculture. Nature has polyculture. And nature doesn't thrive on annuals, it thrives on perennials. And in nature, we know it's working pretty well. So the real challenge is, how do we learn from nature how to do this in our agriculture? And again, since we've devoted so little of our energy in the past to that, I think there's a lot of potential that we haven't explored yet. But that's the direction that the Land Institute is moving in. And you can, and we in fact did, not with perennials, but just with annuals. We did a little bit of polyculture experiment on our own farm in North Dakota. We raised some wheat and flax together, planted them together in the same field, and also flax and lentils together. And it really worked pretty well. You know, and you, in a wheat-flax combination, the wheat is clearly the predominant crop. So planting flax in there, it doesn't affect the yield of the wheat at all, because it will still thrive in there. The flax obviously is not going to be great yielding, but you don't have, the only expense you've got is the seed, because you seed it at the same time, you harvest it at the same time. The problem with it was not with growing it, it was with the processing. Because what you do is you run that wheat and flax through a rotary screen cleaner, and you screen the flax off to separate the two seeds, right? And flax, of course, is a smaller seed. And that was easy, you could do that. But then all of your foreign material ended up in the flax. And you take that to the local elevator and say, what the hell are you bringing me? And flax is hard to clean anyway, and then we got all that foreign material in there. So we stopped doing it. We may go back to it. What we have to do is install our own cleaner to do to run the flax through as a kind of preliminary cleaning operation to get it to a point where it's acceptable in the marketplace. And flax and lentils are fairly competitive, so you can determine which crop you want to be the predominant one by how heavy you seed. If you seed the lentils heavier than the flax, it will be the predominant crop. If you do it the other way, flax will be the predominant crop. But then you start to have some synergies. You know, a problem with lentils is that, you know, it grows very close to the ground, and so it's hard to harvest. If you put flax in there, the lentil has to stretch up, you know, because the flax is a very rigid crop. It has to grow up to get to sunlight, so it actually gets up off the ground, so it's easier to harvest. So you have some benefits like that. But you know, we know it's possible. You know, some of us have done it, and you know, we have to work out some of the issues around processing, etc. Yes.
You've tended to focus on the new idea space, but when it comes to change, there also are factors like crises there, like economic feasibility. And when, in terms of recycling, there are a lot of arguments for recycling. And it's when they didn't have any place to put the waste that there really was some impetus going in.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, how do you assess the relative balance of
Yeah.
those factors?
Yeah, and there's another thing, and Ugo mentions this in his book, that when you have these new idea spaces, you also have the resistance, because some people see this new idea coming along and they don't like it, so they start to actually resist that change, right? So you've got that dynamics taking place. That's very clear. He also gives examples throughout history where you had, one of them was the printing press. And he argues that there were actually early varieties of printing with mechanical means that far outdated, you know, when the printing press revolution actually took place. But the local circumstances weren't right for it to take off, and so it didn't take off. And you can see that certainly happening, you know, around the food system. So it's that combination of a new idea space with the right circumstances in order to make it happen. Now, one of the things that I think we should, and you know, Milton Friedman, who was not my favorite economist, but he said one thing that I think was exactly on target, and that is change rarely comes without a crisis. But when the crisis comes, you need ideas floating around to direct the change. I think that's the mindset that we have to have here, because we know that we're not going to be short of crises, you know, given the challenges that we're going to have coming in the future. The issue is, do we have the ideas, the models, that can take advantage of those opportunities for change and move it in the right direction? And then always keep in mind that in anything like this, there are always surprises. So no matter how well we plan, how well we anticipate the changes that are going to come at us, there are going to be surprises along the way. So we should always build into our thinking, our activities, our initiatives, our innovations, you know, the fact that we're going to get some things wrong, and provide for that flexibility, you know, to shift things and move things in a different direction when they don't work out. So these are all very challenging kinds of things, but I also think that there are incredible opportunities that we did not have in my generation that the future generation is going to have. Yes?
Hi, thank you for speaking today. It's very exciting and enriching to see this sort of discourse happening in my old Somalec room where I took a biology class. You mentioned Dan Barber,
Yeah.
and I've heard him as well as other food movement advocates like Michael Pollan address the perennial concern of food movement as being a socially elite thing. And Dan Barber had mentioned in an interview I heard that all major movements, women's suffrage, civil rights movement, and now the food movement, start with the wealthy. Are you satisfied with that
Start
answer?
with
the wealthy.
the wealthy?
The
Yeah.
affluent people. Are you satisfied with that answer? Would you like to make it, is it a good, right assessment? Is there an addendum? Just kind of.
Yeah. Well, like I said, Dan's a dear friend of mine. I don't agree with him on everything. I perfectly understand where Dan's coming from in that, because the world that he grew up in and has been a part of, that's been his experience. The world that I grew up in was not that. And so I look more at the history, you know, of how change happens, and also from our faith tradition. And I mentioned this to somebody earlier today, you know, Martin Luther, which I assume you all know. He, in one of his Christmas sermons, he talked about, he said, who could have imagined that a couple of teenagers giving birth to their first child in a cold, smelly barn without so much as a pail of warm water would change the world. So, and that isn't just, you know, that one example. I mean, if you look throughout history, a lot of the change, or if, you know, what happened in Egypt didn't happen because of the wealthy. You know, it happened because particularly a very energized culture of young people, primarily through Twitter and Facebook, etc., you know, created this revolution. There was not a lot of wealth behind that. So I think we have to look at all of the alternatives. It is true in instances, and it could be well true at Dartmouth College. You've got somebody that's going to give them $200 million. It's somebody wealthy that's going to create that change. So we shouldn't close our eyes to that, but we should also not limit ourselves to the possibility that, and this was attributed to, what's her name, you know, never doubt that a small group of people. Yes, right. And I understand nobody's ever been able to verify that she actually said that. It's been attributed to her. But nevertheless, the concept is true, that a small group of people, you know, bring about changes because that's also very much a part of our long history. So even if though you're not wealthy, don't excuse yourself from it. Yes.
I wanted to hear your thoughts on a few issues I see in organic farming. One is the fact that we can now use, there's all these OMRI-listed pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, you know, that are allowed for organic use and might be safer and break down in the soil, but it just seems a little wrong that, you know, you go out to a field in California and all of the vegetable beds are wrapped in plastic and they're spraying the fields, yet they're certified organic. And then the other is organic seed availability. My certifier frowns on anything but certified organic seed. I mean, that's in the organic standards. Yet I go to all of the seed catalogs and there's maybe less than 10 organic vegetable seed companies in the country. Yeah. And they're all the same varieties. I mean, the lack of genetic diversity is just really frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me first of all say that, and I was part of the National Organic Standards Board when we developed the rule to implement the law. And there are a lot of things I don't like about what we came up with, but you know, you always got, well, first of all, you got the government telling you what you can and can't do, so which is one problem. And then the other is you had, you know, all of these debates about, you know, where people wanted to go, and the processing and retail sectors of the industry wanted to go in a different direction where the farmers wanted to go. So, you know, you had all of those. But, you know, just to give you one example of that, you know, there were a number of us on the National Organic Standards Board that wanted to have a provision in the standard that would require organic farmers to restore the biological health of their soil. We thought that was, you know, this goes back to Sir Albert Howard, and beyond that, this was a fundamental part of what organic was about. When we proposed that, and we had written a standard around that, when we proposed that to the lawyers at USDA, they said, can't do that, because in regulations you have to be able to answer with a yes or a no. Now, how do you answer that with a yes or a no? So that's why we ended up with, you can use natural inputs except those that are on the non-allowed list, that are on the non-allowed list, that's a yes or a no. You can't use synthetics except those that are on the allowed list, that's a yes or a no. But that's not what organic is about. You know, you can, in terms of the challenges I talked about, you know, you can be an organic farmer and get your Chilean nitrate from 3,000 miles away and your seaweed from Japan. You're not going to be any more sustainable than the farmers who are using anhydrous ammonia. So these are issues where we have to go beyond the organic standards and look at some of those principles that I think are a part of organic, the agroecological component, and learn from that. And there is increasingly some important news here, and if you haven't looked at this, in the July 1 issue of 2010, Nature magazine had a couple of really important research studies that were published around pest management. And they looked at some organic management, and the organic management was not, just using natural inputs instead of synthetics, but it was truly agroecological kind of management systems, and then compared that to conventional management. And what they discovered was that in the agroecological management system, they developed what they called a pest evenness, or an organism evenness. In other words, you have this community of species within the system that prevented the room for pests to get established. Whereas in the conventional system, where you use the pesticides to get rid of the pest, you destroyed this evenness and opened the opportunity for pests to come in. So that over a period of time, you had a much better pest control in the organic system than you had in the conventional system. Now, that's been established now by peer-reviewed research. So I think it's a very significant piece of information that we need to look at and take seriously, again, as we look into these long-term kinds of futures. So I think that what we need to do with inorganic is we have to get beyond this notion that if you're just organic, you're going to be okay, because you're not. We have to look at what some of the fundamental principles are. And maybe here is where, for all of the things I don't like about Rudolf Steiner, his concept of a farm as an organism, which is developed in such a way that the organism is self-renewing and self-regulating. And at any time you need to bring in something from outside, it's an indication that your farm is sick. I think if we can use those kinds of principles, and then, as he said, constantly pay attention to the inner workings of nature. What's going on in nature that we can continue to learn from? Not that, gee, I figured this out and now my farm is going to be sustainable in the future. Keep tending to the inner workings. Those principles, I think, are critical for us as we try to address the issues that you're raising. Yes.
What about biotechnology's place in this new agriculture? The industry will claim we've got seeds out there that will do a fraction of a modern, produce their own nitrogen like what you do, things like that. Where do you see that?
Yeah. Well, I'm not one of the people that think that genetic engineering is evil. I think that the way in which we're applying it today is dysfunctional because we're using genetic engineering in the same way that we use chemical technology. That is, it's attacking a single problem with an intervention as a therapy to solve the problem. So you got a pest, you come in with a therapy from outside to get rid of the pest. That's how we did it in the era of chemical pest management. And now in genetic engineering, you come in with a single gene, to try to deal with the pest or to deal with whatever else. And that's what's dysfunctional about it, because nature always is going to come in and adapt to that. And then you created the problem that you're trying to solve. So, and as I mentioned in class earlier today, I'm not a geneticist, so I'm totally dependent on people who are. But I especially have some colleagues, some friends who are working in the world of genetics and medicine. And, for a long time we had people working in genetics and medicine say, well, if we just discover the gene that causes heart disease and we modify that gene, we'll solve that problem. Almost nobody is saying that anymore. Because what we've learned in the field of genetics is that the genome is not fixed, so that you can just come in with another gene and then modify it and then you've changed it forever. Genes get turned on and off depending on the environment, depending on the circumstances, depending on the organism, etc. So it's a very fluid, dynamic kind of thing. And you have to look at the whole system. You have to look at what causes heart disease, what's going on in the environment that causes those genes to turn on and off, instead of simply assuming you can fix it with one gene. And so, but here's the important thing. That genetic information is vital to addressing that problem. Now in agriculture, we haven't moved to that point yet, but some people in agriculture are beginning to, and that's what we need to do. And then if we can begin to learn the role at the genetic level within systems agriculture, within these natural systems and how they function, that's critical information to help us how to design the systems so that they can become self-renewing and self-regulating. So that's the direction we have to move in. Unfortunately, companies who are primarily investing in this are not going to make much money on that because they make money selling products, not selling information. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. Hopefully our land-grant universities will begin to make that transition and start to work like this and develop.
Yeah, along those lines, I'm just wondering, you touched on this a few times, but there are tremendous entrenched interests that want to keep things just as they are, or they want to find a way to make a profit on this transition that we're talking about, or at least the rhetoric about it. What kind of partnership should we be looking to develop, or should we be looking to develop partnerships with those interests?
That's a really critical question, and I certainly, as you would expect, I don't have a quick answer to that.
Well, it's not a quick question.
No, but here again, there's some things to look at here. One is that especially at the amount of investment that people have to make now in these huge infrastructures that we have, when even a little thing goes wrong, they can get in trouble really, really fast. And you can see that in Tyson Foods, for example, when, now that the price of corn is going up, their bottom line doesn't look that great. And that's just one, in a way, that's one small item in there. But when, in other words, and here again is where the ecologists and evolutionary biologists are helpful, I think, because one of the things they point out is that the more uniform that a system becomes and the larger it becomes, the more brittle it becomes. And therefore, you have one kind of disturbance that comes in and it can really destroy something really, really fast. And so I think those of us who see this different kind of world shouldn't allow ourselves to become intimidated by these huge companies who are making these huge investments and pushing things, obviously, in a particular kind of direction. Because in this longer-term future, there are a lot of vulnerabilities that stand in the way for them. And the important thing for us is to have the models available so when that starts to crash, that there's an alternative that we can go to. And here again, the good news is that we have farmers all around the world that have already transitioned to some of these new systems, and some of them are quite amazing. One of my favorite examples is a farmer in southern Japan, and we invited him to the Leopold Center a few years ago because I heard about him and wanted to hear his story. And he said that up until 1987, he was a typical industrial rice farmer. Bought his fertilizers, it was all monoculture rice, bought his fertilizers for fertility, bought his pesticides for pest control, and by all of the industrial standards, he was enormously successful. His yields were higher than any other farmers in southern Japan. And then he said, one day, he literally stood at the edge of his rice paddies, and he realized that every year, everything that he earned off of his rice paddies, he had to reinvest in the next year's crop. He didn't get to keep anything. He didn't want to do that anymore. And so it was totally driven by the economics of the situation. And he understood somehow intuitively that simply making it a little more efficient, so he could use a little less fertilizer, a little less pesticide, wasn't going to be a solution to the problem. He had to redesign the system. So how was he going to do that? So he came up with an idea. What would happen if he took the best wisdom from the past and married that with the best science available? Could he come up with a new system that would get him out of this economic climate? And so, wisdom from the past, he remembered that farmers in Japan years ago used to raise ducks in their rice paddies. Why were they doing that? So he said he got a piece of plastic electric fence and put it down in the middle of his rice paddy and put some ducklings in and just sat back and watched. And he noticed that these little guys were eating insects off the rice plant. And he thought, well, if I had enough of the right kind of ducks, could they eat all the insects? I wouldn't need to buy an insecticide anymore. That's money I could keep in my pocket. So he goes to the breeders, and they say, well, yeah, there is a breed of duck. It's called an agamo, which is a cross between a wild drake and a domesticated female. And it would seem that they would be pretty aggressive insect raisers. That's what they would recommend. So he starts to breed these ducks, puts them into his rice paddies, discovers that 200 ducks per hectare, and they eat all the insects for him. So now he doesn't need to buy an insecticide anymore. And then he's thinking, again, wisdom from the past. Farmers in the past used to raise fish in their rice paddies. And then when the Green Revolution came along and the focus was all on producing more rice, they started to use insecticides to get rid of the pests to increase the rice yields, which of course killed the fish. So they had to stop it. Now he's not using it anymore. He wants to put fish in. So he goes to the experts again and talks to them about this. They say, well, we don't think, in this case, we don't think it's going to work because you're going to put the fish in as little fingerlings, and you got ducks in there. They're going to dive down and eat the fish, so you got a choice. It's one or the other. So he's not quite ready to accept that. So he said he got a tub, filled it with water, put little fingerling loaches, which is the favorite fish apparently in rice paddies, into the tub of water, put the ducklings in. Sure enough, they dive down and ate the fish. And then he said, I got to thinking, but in a rice paddy, the water's cloudy, but still having cloudy water. So he got a few handsful of soil, put it in, stirred it up, put the loaches back in, put the ducklings in. Ducklings didn't eat the fish anymore. So he starts to experiment in the rice paddy again. And now he notices something else. In the rice paddy, there's also a weed in southern Japan that grows. It's called a zola. It's a fern-like plant that grows on the surface like a water lily, and it multiplies like a water lily. And so farmers routinely use an herbicide to kill it off, because otherwise it'd grow and choke out the rice plants. But now with both ducks and fish in there, they both feed on the azolla. They love it as a food source. So they keep it sufficiently under control that it doesn't spread, so he doesn't need to worry about controlling it. And it also provides cover, additional cover for the fish, so the ducks can't get at the fish. And then after he's doing this, so now he's doing ducks and fish in his rice paddies. And then he said, after doing this for a while, he noticed that the nitrogen levels were going up in his water. He couldn't figure out why that was happening, because he knew there wasn't enough nitrogen in the droppings of the ducks and the fish to account for that. So again, he goes back to the scientists, to the experts, and he said, well, yeah, we've done some research with this, and there's actually, the azolla plant actually has a relationship with bacteria that produces nitrogen in water, much like a leguminous plant does on land, and that's where your nitrogen's coming from. So he said now the nitrogen from this weed plus the droppings from the ducks and the fish provide all the fertility he needs, so he doesn't need to use a fertilizer anymore. The ducks take care of all of the insects, so he doesn't need to use an insecticide. And now, instead of producing one crop, namely rice, he's producing 5 food products. He's producing duck meat, plus duck eggs, which he also harvests, plus fish meat, plus rice. And since he's not using insecticides, he can grow fruit trees on the periphery of the rice paddies again, so he's also producing figs. So he's now producing 5 commodities instead of 1, and doing it without dramatically reduced energy inputs. And then the last time I talked to him, he said, my rice yields are going up about 20 to 30% now. I said, how's that happening? Well, he said, the reason it's happening is because the root crown of my rice plants now are about twice the size that they were in the old system, so there's more tillering and therefore more rice. He said, I have no idea why the root crowns. There's something about the system that's causing the root crown to grow bigger. So, I would love to grow rice and ducks and fish in my farm in North Dakota, but, we're in a different ecology. It's not going to happen. What I need to learn is what's going on in a prairie ecology that can apply those same principles. And that's where, there's paucity of information. And as we move again into that future, that's what we need to figure out and then develop those kinds of systems. So you can dramatically increase your food production with reduced energy output. And there are a number of examples around the world like this where farmers are experimenting with.
I've seen one of those wheatgrass fields actually planted in central Kansas. I grew up about 2 miles from where one was planted.
Perhaps we should thank Fred officially, and then if any of you have questions and you want to come up and talk with him
Sure,
more
I'll hang
informally.
around. Yeah.